Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 30th day of March in the year 2016. It is a pleasure to be with you on this Wednesday. Let me first apologize for not having a program yesterday. I was ready to go, and my computer decided that it was time to install Windows 10. And so I had turned the computer on before I went to our regular weekly Rotary meeting, and when I came back, the computer was in the midst of loading Windows 10. It was 47% complete according to the screen. And then after it was finally installed, I couldn't find anything. And I obviously was in a state of panic until finally it got to be so late that it was obvious we could not do a program. So what we did is we kind of went through a few practice sessions to make sure we had one today. So let me apologize for not doing the program yesterday. I was ready to go, but the technology was not, I guess. And so anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you on this beautiful Wednesday. We have a beautiful day here in Southern Appalachia. Mid-50s, sun shining, blue skies. It is just gorgeous. I understand we're in for a couple of days of not so great weather coming up, a little bit cold and damp and some rain over the weekend and all of that. But given the rather mild winter we've had here in the mountains this year, I think we can put up with a couple of bad days as we move into April. The 1st of April, of course, is Friday. So I hope that you are doing well, and I do want to encourage you to participate in our program by picking up the phone and giving us a call and sharing some of your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners. There's a particular article that I want to share with you in a moment, but let me get some of the housekeeping duties out of the way first. First of all, of course, as we do every day, the phone number. Our number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to send me an email and communicate your ideas or thoughts directly with me, I would appreciate hearing from you, and I'd like to reserve the right to, without identifying you, of course, to share your thoughts and your ideas with our listeners if they indeed appear to be to contain ideas or thoughts that our listeners ought to know about. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906, all one word, @gmail.com. And finally, I want to remind you of our Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be on our Facebook page, and on it, as you scroll down, are a number of entries, a number of postings that I've put on there in recent weeks and months relating to some of the hot issues, if you will, political issues of the day, where possible, where they affect the mission of our program. In other words, where they affect the issue of the Constitution itself. I've tried to make a point of screening programs in such a way that they kind of fit that bill. And of course, with the current election campaign going on, it's a little bit difficult to resist. I think that if you make the operative assumption that what's happening during our election campaign relates to our political system and thereby relates to the Constitution of the United States, if not directly, then indirectly. If you make that assumption, then I guess you could say that almost any commentary related to our current elections is fair game within the mission of the Virtual Center. Yesterday, after I was unable to deliver a program yesterday, I did go on Facebook and I made an effort to put on Facebook a little bit of what I thought would be yesterday's program. And it was principally in the context of somewhat of a review of material that we did Monday. So what I thought that I might do today in returning to that is go back and pick up where we left off on Monday, looking at two pieces of political writing authored by James Madison. The first one in January of 1792, the second one in September of 1792. And we looked at both of those documents on Monday. I wanted to review them and to touch upon what I think are significant highlights from each of them. But as I mentioned when we opened the program a few moments ago, a friend shared with me an article, gave it to me at lunch today, which is just about an hour ago. It's an article that appeared in the Huffington Post on the 22nd of this month. In other words, today, of course, is the 29th. So it was dated a week ago. And the title of the article is An Open Letter to My Republican Friends. Its author, Richard North Patterson. So again, first of all, I want to recommend this article to you. I have read it rather rapidly. I kind of skimmed it. And what I recognize is its value. And so what I wanted to do is encourage you to take the opportunity in the next day or two and go to Google and type in the title of the article, An Open Letter to My Republican Friends by Richard North Patterson, appeared in the March 22nd Huffington Post under HuffPost Politics, under that particular section. It is an incredibly well-written criticism of of much of what's going on within today's Republican Party. It is devastating. And I thought that what I did is I checked a couple of paragraphs just to kind of give you a flavor. Let me just share with you. First of all, the article is addressed to my cherished friends. And so basically this fellow is writing to fellow Republicans, but they would not be leadership elements within the Republican Party. They would be basically members of the followers, if you will, regular Republican supporters and voters. Opening paragraph. The Republican Party has become intellectually and morally bankrupt, a mockery of its traditions, corrosive to our society, our civility, and our capacity to govern. This is not a temporary condition. It is woven into the fabric of the party. Unless and until it reverses course, you should take your votes and money and walk away. And then the article proceeds to go on and substantively address a number of the issues associated with that. It is not a plea for Republicans to support Democrats. In other words, it is an acknowledgement that there are issues and problems within the Democratic Party as well. Excuse me. The difference is that those problems within the Democratic Party are, in the author's view, fixable. His concern is that the problems he addresses in the Republican Party are not fixable. They require something much more drastic before the Republican Party can begin to recover and can begin to stand for the principles and the ideals which cause many of these loyal Republicans to whom he's writing to consistently support the Republican Party. His point is that these people and their views and their values and their political ideologies have pretty much been abandoned, have been sacrificed by the party. And his point seems to me to be that while a lot of this lies at the feet of Donald Trump, it's not exclusively Trump's problem. In effect, the author seems to be saying that Trump is more symbolic of what's wrong with the party. He's the logical outcome of some of the ills that have inflicted and infected the Republican Party. Let me share with you a paragraph in which he makes the point that this is not a plea for people to switch their votes and vote Democratic. On the contrary, he says, knowing you as I do, I know that you're troubled by the direction of your party. Little wonder you are mainstream Republicans whose mainstream has run dry. But I also accept that for you, the Democrats may not be the answer. That you see them as feckless devotees of identity politics and too much government. Don't trust Hillary Clinton and believe Bernie Sanders would drive us off the fiscal cliff. I'm not writing to quarrel with these beliefs, nor do I suggest that unchallenged dominance by the Democrats would serve the country well. But then he basically goes into what I think is one of the most devastating paragraphs in the entire article. He said, to compare the two parties at this time in our history is to indulge in false equivalency. For rationalizing the GOP's pathology by responding with a partisan tit-for-tat is not adequate to the circumstances. The sins you perceive in Democrats are the usual ones: misguided policies, ill-chosen means for dubious ends, and the normal complement of rhetorical dishonesty and political squalor. I think you get a flavor for how well written this piece is. However mistaken you may find Clinton and Sanders on the issues, their debate is addressed to the world as it exists, and therefore open to a sensible critique. In other words, while you may disagree with what the Democrats are saying, the fact of the matter is what they're saying and proposing is fixable. The squalor to which the GOP has sunk, an alternate reality rooted in anger and mendacity, transcends mere differences in policy, threatening the country with profound, perhaps irreparable damage. This is not simply about Donald Trump. Trump is not the result of forces which will come and go, but of a deterioration within the Republican Party that's been accelerating for years. The GOP has become a Frankenstein monster, assembled from dysfunction, demagoguery, myopia, and myth, nurtured in a fever swamp where lies and hysteria kill off reason. Nothing better will arise until you help drive a stake through its heart. One of our ongoing disagreements has been about the nature of the party and where you fit within it. With respect to GOP extremism in areas like climate denial, gun violence, or reproductive rights, you often say, quote, but I'm not like that, unquote. But the party is like that. You may be moderate in your views. The party is not. Even candidates with temperate instincts must go along to survive, or meet the fate of John Huntsman, mocked for publicly accepting climate change and evolution. Long since, the GOP killed its moderates and trashed everything they stood for. It has replaced respected figures like William Cohen Richard Lugar, and John Danforth, with rigid ideologues like Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, and social illiterates like James Inhofe, Jeff Sessions, and Richard Shelby. On issue after issue, they have embraced an orthodoxy rooted in extremism and divorced from fact. These dynamics forced Mitt Romney to win the nomination by running so far right that he could never get back. And that was the lesson learned among the party base, that Romney was not nearly extreme enough. In short, the Republican Party no longer belongs to you, or you in it. 2016 is proving the point. And then the article goes on and makes specific references to things like climate change, foreign policy, racism, threats of discrimination, and unequal treatment before the law, many of the things that really infect our society today, and basically takes the Republican Party to task for some of its positions on them. It's a very, very positive, a very powerful article on today's Republican Party, and one cannot but marvel at how well it is written. That was the thing that impressed me as I skimmed through it. So I encourage you to take a few moments sometime in the next few days and Google this particular article, An Open Letter to My Republican Friends, from the Huffington Post, dated March 22nd, 2016, the author Richard Patterson. I think you'll find it a read well worth your time. I personally plan on reading it much more carefully in the next day or so. So again, that's one of those gems that I'm so appreciative of my friend who gave me a hard copy of that piece and said, you need to try this one on for size. He says it all in a way which is a little bit difficult to refute. In other words, the way he makes his points is really hard to quibble with. It's pretty powerful. Let's go back to the 18th century. A piece that I put on Facebook last evening basically makes this point, that when you look at what's going on in our politics, sometimes you begin to wonder. And so what I said was, sometimes there seemed to be much more sanity, a hell of a lot more dignity in the 18th century than there is today. And so in the piece that I put on Facebook said, for evidence of that, let's do it. Let's go back to the 18th century. And most specifically, I was focusing on the two articles on party written in 1792 by James Madison. The first one appeared in the National Gazette on the 23rd of January, 1792. The second, dated the 22nd of September, 1792. We looked at these two letters, both of them relatively brief, at least in the context of pieces that James Madison traditionally writes. But it seems to me they are extremely powerful. It's important, I think I made this point on the air on Monday, so let me just repeat it again because I think it's well worth it. It's important to look at the timeline here and recognize that the new government under the Constitution doesn't even begin until March of '89, when Washington is inaugurated as the nation's first president. So from March of '89 until January of '92, the political situation in the nation seems to have deteriorated. And again, this all depends on how you define deterioration, I know. But Madison speaks to some serious challenges that the nation is facing in January of '92 And these problems apparently occurred and metastasized very rapidly. Because with the inauguration of Washington and the demise of the struggle between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over ratification of the Constitution, it appeared that the nation was on course to come together and rally around the Constitution, rally around the popularity of President Washington, and rally around the first elected Congress under this new Constitution. And to think that within 3 years, the situation deteriorates to the point that Madison is speaking to the emergence of parties within the new government. And he's seeing a problem with parties, and it's important to recognize this, because in his definition of the word party, he means faction. And as we know, Madison put the word faction on the political map, so to speak, in the Federalist Papers, focusing especially in Federalist number 10, Federalist number 51, and references in 2 or 3 others of his Federalist Papers to the necessity of controlling the violence of faction, self-interest, organized interest groups of influential people who rally together in order to achieve their own selfish ends at the expense of the public interest. And Madison indicates in January of 92 that factionalism, well-organized political organizations designed to promote self-interest of their members, has already inflicted the new government very early in its history under the Constitution. And more specifically, what Madison does in January of 1792, when he puts this entry into the National Gazette, is to address the issue of party by primarily emphasizing the threat of party, of faction, to the well-being of the nation at large, and lays out a strategy, a formula, a recipe that he believes government must follow in order to control the inevitability of factions within government, the inevitability that self-interest will rear its ugly head, especially in a republic, especially in a government based upon popular participation. Madison's concern is that Republican government, more than almost any other kind, is susceptible to faction. In fact, if you remember, in the opening paragraph of Federalist number 10, Madison made the point that popular government's tendency toward faction has been the ingredient that more than anything else has caused Republican governments to fail throughout history. Their inclination, popular government's inclination towards faction, has spelled the end for every Republican experiment up to this time. In order to keep the new nation under the Constitution from falling victims to that same historical pattern, Madison lays out a strategy or a formula, an agenda that government needs to follow in order to deal constructively with faction, with party. The point that I would make here is that there is nothing in this approach that indicates that Madison has anywhere bought into the positive nature of parties. The idea of the loyal opposition, the idea of a large, open-ended pair of political parties, both of them amorphous, in other words, both of them open and malleable, both of them willing to accept support from a variety of different groups and different interests. All of them organized for one purpose. That one purpose is to win control of government by majority rule. In other words, the key to our modern political two-party system is for various and disparate groups and interests to come together, put aside the things that divide them, and temporarily unite for the benefit of all. If we put aside our differences and work together, we can create a powerful enough force to wrest power, political power, within this system. That's the nature of the modern two-party system. That's the two-party system that promotes moderation, compromise, negotiation, deliberation. That's the nature of the two-party system that emerges much later than it does in this period. In other words, what I'm suggesting is here in January of 1792, Madison is talking about party as faction. It's a negative. And he's laying out a strategy that government must adopt, must follow in order to control it. Because as Madison said, parties are inevitable. In Federalist number 10, he said that factions are sown in the nature of man. In this document, Madison opens by saying, in every political society, parties are unavoidable. And government must make its first object, its principal agenda item, to be what he calls combat this evil. And then he lays out a 5-point strategy for doing that. And we looked at each of these the other day. I'll just briefly make mention of the 5. Number 1, establishing political equality among all. Treating everybody the same. But more importantly, making sure that people believe that they are being treated equally. One of the big issues that's going on within the Republican Party right now in our election campaign is Donald Trump claiming that he's not being treated fairly because the party establishment is holding secret meetings in order to try to deny him the nomination. So therefore, Trump just yesterday rescinded his commitment to support the party's nominee, whoever it might be. In other words, what he's suggesting is that if he doesn't get the nomination, he'll walk and he'll take as many of his supporters with him as he can. That would effectively doom the Republican Party in this election. It probably would result in such an overwhelming Democratic victory that many establishment Republicans are beginning to worry not only about the White House, not even just about the Senate. Some of them are beginning to even question whether they'll be able to hold on to the House of Representatives in the face of such an overwhelming defeat. So this idea of being treated fairly is important. My issue, my point, the thing that I want to stress is that there's a difference between treating people fairly and appearing to treat people fairly. The point being that one would expect that if fair treatment is the goal, then government would adopt policies to make sure that people were treated fairly. But from the perspective of governance, from the perspective of political government, more important than treating people fairly is convincing people that they are being treated fairly, to the point that they don't object. So obviously, the best way to ensure that people will believe they're being treated fairly is to treat them fairly. We know that. But the fact of the matter is, sometimes there's a difference. And so the PR campaign that goes along with government's policies, the PR campaign that sells the equity associated with a particular piece of legislation or a particular policy, is important. So Madison's number one objective, establishing political equality among all, making sure that, at least from a political standpoint, everybody's being treated the same. The second one, Madison said, that government must do is withhold unnecessary opportunities from a few, from the wealthy, the few being the wealthy. Withhold unnecessary opportunities from a few to increase the inequality of property by an immoderate and especially unmerited accumulation of riches. By definition, the wealthy are going to have an advantage anyway. They don't need extra help, Madison is saying. The last thing that government wants to do is pursue policies which give even further advantage to the few over the many, because the implication of that would be a degree of inequality in society which would be unsustainable. The reason I mention that is because that is exactly what we're witnessing in our contemporary society today, is a level of inequality unprecedented in American history. Here we are in 1792, 3 years after the Constitution is ratified, and Madison is already warning the nation against the dangers of inequality in a republican, in an open society. The third piece of this agenda for government, Madison says, by the silent operation of laws. And of course, what he means there is under the radar. Make sure it happens, but don't brag on it. Don't call attention to it. Just do it. By the silent operation of laws, Madison says, which, without violating the rights of property, reduce extreme wealth towards a state of mediocrity and raise extreme indigence towards a state of comfort. Government must very subtly, very unobtrusively, must engage in policies and programs designed to raise the poor and depress the wealth. Today, the big issue is so-called redistribution of property through our tax policies, using a progressive approach to taxation to tax everybody according to their means. The idea being the people who make the most can pay the most. The people making the least should have to pay the least. The purpose of this is in order to drive people toward moderation, toward the center, to seemingly repress the advantages of those at the top, and at the same time to ameliorate the negatives being experienced by those at the bottom. Madison is saying, 3 years after the Constitution of the United States is adopted, that governments must consciously pursue a policy designed to create a sense of community within the nation by repressing exorbitant wealth on the one hand and doing everything you can do to lift those at the bottom towards what he calls a state of comfort. Madison's fourth agenda item for government: government must abstain from measures which operate differently on different interests, and particularly such as favor one interest at the expense of another. If government appears to be pursuing policies and programs which benefit certain groups of people at the expense of other groups, it's asking for trouble. What Madison says is that government must abstain from measures that do that. Again, we're getting into the issue of what appears to be unfavorable treatment of one group as opposed to another. And the point I would make to keep in mind is that there's a difference between real unfairness, really discriminating against one group at the expense of another, and the illusion that such discrimination is going on. Oftentimes, government can blur the problems through PR efforts. But the fact of the matter is, when people become convinced that some are being treated unfairly at the expense of others, the nation has problems. And the fifth agenda item Madison touches upon is the one that he elaborates in Federalist number 10, the idea of checks and balances. Making one party, one faction, a check on the other. So far as the existence of parties cannot be prevented, nor their views accommodated. Madison is implying in that fifth item that what has to happen is that since parties are inevitable, government must successfully use one to counterbalance the other, rather than support certain groups which gain political advantage over everybody else. In other words, government must constantly be the manager, be the balancer, be the honest broker, as it were. Government can't afford to be seen as an ally of certain groups against other groups. And the point that I would make here is that if you think back to Hamilton's financial program as it's being explained to Congress during this period, these 5 items that Madison lays out for government are clearly directed right at the Federalist Party programs, right at Hamilton's financial program. When we looked at Hamilton's program some weeks and months ago, funding an assumption, a program designed principally to buy the loyalty of the nation's investors and financial gurus by creating lucrative opportunities to buy up cheap certificates, cheap bonds, and cash them in for new bonds, which would pay the interest that is touted or listed in the deal. In other words, convert cheap paper into more expensive paper. The fact of the matter is, when we look at the results of Hamilton's funding and assumption of state debts, what we see is that the Washington administration, Hamilton's program, specifically lays out a strategy whereby the wealthy, the nation's investors, are going to be given the opportunity to profit directly from government's policies under the financial programs that he is promoting. He is guaranteeing that those on the know, those on the inside, those with information, are able to speculate in the nation's debt and directly profit from it. Hamilton's goal being to buy the support of the nation's financial interests, its investors, and enlist that support behind the Constitution and behind the new government. The idea being that if you are receiving regular payments from the government, you will support it. Basically, what Madison is laying out in his strategy is that this is exactly what government ought not to be doing. In other words, Madison's 5-point strategy here is a veiled attack on the policies of the Hamilton Department of Treasury, a veiled attack against the unfair, prejudiced policies of the Washington administration 3 years into its existence. So philosophically, Madison is writing about the nature of Republican government. But politically and realistically, he's talking directly about the Hamilton Federalists. And he's basically saying that a republic cannot withstand the kind of policies that this administration is pursuing. And of course, what Madison is doing is laying the groundwork for the organization of that opposition and its ultimate emergence into a second political party. The party that will get Thomas Jefferson elected president in the so-called Revolution of 1800, the election of 1800. And I think Madison's closing sentence in that paragraph, after the 5-point agenda, is very critical, is very important. Madison says, if this is not the language of reason, it is that of republicanism. It seems to me you can take that sentence and you can make it say a number of different things. In other words, you can speculate as to what Madison seemed to be saying in that particular sentence. This may not make sense, Madison's saying, but the fact of the matter is, this is what republicanism is about. This is what Republican government is about. This is what government must do in order to make Republican government work in this new nation. Government must pursue policies which are exactly opposed, exactly opposite to what the government is doing. In other words, if you were to put words in Madison's mouth, you could say that what Madison is saying here is that the programs and the policies being pursued by the Washington administration, with Alexander Hamilton at their head, is literally jeopardizing the future of the republic. It is playing with fire. It is playing with dynamite, because it shows every potential, Madison is suggesting, of sinking this republic by allowing this republic to go the way of all previous republics in the past, namely government pursuing policies which benefit the few at the expense of the many. In a republic, Madison said, this is suicide. So you've got this paragraph, this particular document, brief as it is, that can be read on two different levels: the political level and the philosophical level. And then Madison brings this particular document to an end by addressing the issue of the inevitability of parties and the need to counterbalance them. In other words, what Madison does is take this opportunity to reinforce the formula that he laid out in 1788 in Federalist Number 51, namely by countering ambition with ambition, by using the factions within government to counterbalance each other in the public interest. By definition, that requires that government never allow itself to become a party to the factional squabbles within it. Government must always remain aloof, must always remain out of the political squabbles, must manage the situation for the benefit of the nation. That is what republicanism demands, Madison says. In all political societies, different interests and parties arise out of the nature of things. And the great art of politicians lies in making them checks and balances to each other. The skill of politicians, why we elect skilled politicians, is because of their ability to manage a potentially explosive situation, namely the competition amongst well-organized, presumably well-funded, at least in today's world, well-funded interest groups. Government must remain outside the fray. Government must constantly manage it by using these interests to check and balance each other. Let us then, Madison says, increase these natural distinctions by favoring an inequality of property. In other words, we don't want equality of property. We don't want socialism. What we want is the preservation of the inequality, because it's that inequality which produces the factions which we can successfully manipulate one against the other in order to create equilibrium and balance. Then he goes on and says, let us add to these artificial distinctions by establishing kings and nobles and plebeians. In other words, by having a class system, by having people with different amounts of wealth competing with each other, what you are doing is creating more factions, more divisions, more interest groups, and you are giving more ammunition to government to counterbalance these one against the other in the interests of balance and equilibrium. He says, we shall then have the more checks to oppose to each other. We shall then have the more scales and the more weights to perfect and maintain the equilibrium. This is as little the voice of reason as it is that of republicanism. Madison is re-emphasizing the same closing statement that he used in the previous paragraphs. This may not seem to be reasonable. It may not seem on the surface to make sense. But the reality is this is what Republican government is about. This is what republicanism requires. And this is what government must do in order to ensure that the republic survives. And then he closes in the following way. From the experience in politics of making natural parties, mutual checks on each other, to infer the propriety of creating artificial parties in order to form them into mutual checks is not less absurd than it would be in ethics to say that new vices ought to be promoted where they would counteract each other because this use may be made of existing vices. Madison seems to be saying in that last paragraph, in those last two sentences, that on the surface, while this whole thing of artificially creating differences within society, divisions, would seem to be counterproductive, would seem to be foolish and bad policy, the fact of the matter is it's good policy. And he's using this as an example by saying, this is no more absurd. People might think it's absurd, but it's no more absurd than in ethics to say that new vices in combination with the old vices become ways to balance them off one against the other. In other words, the logic here makes sense, even if it doesn't seem to be politically reasonable. Again, this seems to me to suggest that Madison is writing on two different levels, one philosophical, the other one bottom line political. He is directly aiming this attack against the policies and programs of the Washington administration. And what he is basically saying is that in Hamilton's program, government has committed the unforgivable, the unpardonable sin of directly becoming a participant, a party to the party divisions within the society it was elected to govern. Rather than staying aloof and managing the situation by countering one group against the other, what Hamilton's program has done is enlist government into the process itself and thereby created unbalance and inequity on the side of the few against the best interests of the many. And in the nature of Republican government, Madison seems to be saying, this is suicidal. That document seems to me to be incredibly important in the history of this nation, in the history of the constitutional record of this nation. Because what it suggests is that the things that Madison and Hamilton predicted in the Federalist Papers are indeed coming to pass. That the dangers of factions within a Republican popular government threaten to bring that government down if government does not pursue the proper conduct and the proper direction in the way it governs. I think it's very significant that Madison's criticism here is of the party headed by Hamilton. And what we need to do is remember 4 years before this, Madison and Hamilton were together in authoring the Federalist Papers. So the question, and I think I raised this question on Monday, the question that all of us need to ask is, to what extent has Madison sold out the ideology of the Constitution? To what extent is he falling into the political realities of 19th century, late 18th century politics? To what extent has he abandoned the ideology and the philosophy of the Constitution, a Constitution which he drafted, and a Constitution which he laid out and explained so well in the Federalist Papers? We're coming toward the top of our first hour. We're about 3 minutes before. Let me make one particular point before we kind of close the book on this particular issue, because I think it is critical. Historians have, for a long time, tried to explain the separation in the early 90s between Hamilton and Madison. Some people have argued that Madison reverts or allows himself to fall prey from being an ideological conscience of the new nation under the Constitution to becoming little more than a political hack in the politics that are at play in early history under that very Constitution. I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this over the last couple of days. And one of the things that I've kind of concluded, and I'd like to throw it out for your consideration, is the following. Maybe we're making a mistake. Maybe because Hamilton and Madison cooperated together in writing the Federalist Papers and supporting the Constitution, maybe we are drawing conclusions from that cooperation that are a bit overboard, a bit extreme, and unrealistic. Maybe Madison and Hamilton were not quite as much on the same page as most of us have concluded from the Federalist Papers. Let me go back to something we covered some months ago. You can remember, if you will, when we looked at both Federalist number 9 and Federalist number 10. Federalist number 9 written by Hamilton, Federalist number 10 written by Madison. And if you remember, there was a major difference in the approach to both of those documents. If you remember, both of them were about controlling the violence of factions, controlling popular uprisings within the nation, and why we needed a strong central government under the Constitution to do that. And if you remember Federalist number 9, Hamilton talked about the violence of faction within the nation. But more important, he talked about the need for a strong, aggressive government that is willing to put down insurrection and create order. In other words, if you think back to what we talked about, Hamilton's approach in number 9 was to rely on government, top-down, strong central government, to preserve order throughout the nation. In number 10, in Federalist number 10, Madison dealt with the same issue, namely controlling the violence of factions. But Madison's approach was different than Hamilton's. His approach was not necessarily the strong central government establishing order from the top down. Madison's approach was much more structural. That what you need to do is create divisions within society that government can balance one against the other in order to create stability and order from within rather than from above. And so the difference between the two is in the degree of power in the hands of the federal government. Hamilton, by definition, would tend to downplay or minimize federalism, the power and influence of the states within the Union. Hamilton's priority always is the power of the federal government, not the power of the states or the ability of the states to withstand the imposition of federal power. Madison, on the other hand, is much more supportive of a balance between federal and state, much more supportive of the idea of the internal controls necessary to preserve order. My point as we end our first hour is that maybe we're making a mistake if we assume that Madison and Hamilton are as much on the same ideological page as we tend to assume they were because they both wrote the Federalist Papers. Maybe if you do a more careful analysis of the Federalist Papers and compare them, you can begin to see the seeds of the differences between them which emerge in the 90s. You can see them in the ideology of the 80s in the debate over the Constitution. I think what we're looking at then are two approaches to creating order. Madison clearly is saying that in a republic only one can work. Hamilton is arguing that the top-down approach can work, but in order to do that, you've got to create a sense of unity within the nation that Madison believes is unrealistic. In other words, Madison would believe that the existence of parties, the inevitability of factions, as he said in Federalist number 10, makes it impossible to create a situation where everybody thinks the same and wants the same things. You can't make everybody the same. I would suggest Hamilton's approach to governance suggests that that needs to be government's policy. You need to try. And when government runs into trouble, Hamilton is more than willing to use military force to impose the will of the Union on recalcitrant factions within it. So again, I think we see the seeds of the political divisions of the 1790s in the philosophical support for the Constitution in the late 80s. It's 5 minutes after the hour, 2:05 in the East. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come back and we'll complete our final hour in this week's program here at the Virtual Center. We're going to look at the later document written by Madison in September of 1792 and look at Madison's analysis of the situation, the political situation that the nation finds itself in late 1792. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, then we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour, beginning a little bit late. It's 9 minutes after the hour. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you were just joining us on this Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center, we welcome you to today's program. If you are just joining us, we are dealing with the document that James Madison wrote in January of 1792 on the inevitability of political parties, of factions within popular government, within Republican government. If you've been with us since the very beginning of our program, you probably recognize that our first hour was in many ways a review or an overview, if you will, of some of the issues we dealt with on Monday's program. I really believe, I don't mean to repeat myself or to suggest that we're basically delivering the same materials on two consecutive programs. The reason that I'm doing this is because the more time that I've spent on it in the last couple of days, the more I've come to realize how very, very important this is. In fact, the item that I wrote on Facebook last evening, I believe I mentioned that I am coming to accept the fact that the real emergence of contemporary modern political party systems in the United States really begins in 1792 with this division between Madison and Hamilton. You can see its origins in the Federalist Papers. There seems to be, with the ratification of the Constitution being the common objective, there seems to be more that Madison and Hamilton have in common in the 1780 debates over the Constitution than differences that they might have. But the differences are there. And I think those differences become much more visible and much more challenging in the 1790s with Hamilton's program. And let me kind of jump ahead a bit to kind of give you a view of where I think we're going with this, although we probably won't get there today. It'll probably be in our first program or two in next week's program. And this is the transition from Madison's analysis of parties in 1792 to Hamilton's response in 1796 in the wisdom of George Washington's farewell address. We mentioned the other day that Hamilton wrote Washington's farewell address. What makes this particular analysis of Madison so important is because Madison is defining Hamilton, is defining the mistakes that he believes that Hamilton and the Federalists are making in the way they're governing the new nation under the Constitution. When Washington announces that he will not run for a third term and makes the decision to leave the nation with words of wisdom, if you will, after his two administrations as president, Hamilton seizes the opportunity to put in the words or in the mouth of President Washington a criticism or the alternative to what Madison is saying about parties in the early 1790s. I would suggest then that these documents considered together, Madison in 1792, both January and September, and then Hamilton's response in 1796, really lays out the two approaches to creating stability in government in a popular government like this one. I think that's the only basis on which we can create the root, that we can find and grasp or get our arms around the foundations of two-party politics in America. Because once you begin to grasp the humongous nature of the problem, of the challenges, then Madison's approach, Madison's idea that factions, parties are inevitable, suggests the wisdom of turning this negative into a positive by fashioning a political system around the realities of the situation in which the nation finds itself. I think that this is one of the most important political issues in the nation's history. I believe it's a story that needs to be told. I believe it's a story that historians have found difficult to tell for a long time. I think the answers are to be found in these primary documents. But more importantly, the answers are to be found in our ability to understand and read critically these primary sources. When we get into the heads of Madison and Hamilton respectively, we begin to see the major options, the major choices that the nation faces if it's going to govern itself successfully. Let me shift gears for a moment and share a thought with you from today's politics, as it seemingly, at least in my mind, helps to illuminate the significance of what we're doing. We know that we know several days ago that there was a horrendous terrorist bombing attack in Brussels, at the airport and at the train station. Our politics, our media have been all over the story now for days. And of course, there's no question, the story is not complete. It continues to unfold. In one of the reports on this particular Brussels situation, I was struck by some information that I had heard about or read about nowhere else. And it seems to fit well into the scenario we're painting here between Madison and Hamilton. The questions have been raised as to why the Belgian government was not able to do a better job in rounding up these terrorists before they were able to pull off this massive attack and kill 32 people and wound something in excess of 270 people. There have been all sorts of arguments about lack of communication, about the inability of different agencies and organizations to share information, about the divisions. In fact, we focused on this on one of our programs last week. The divisions that exist within on the continent of Europe between nations, which make cooperation across borders more difficult than they are here in the United States. In other words, while there are differences between one state and the other, they are not the kind of differences that make it impossible to govern. But the reality is, in Europe, many of the differences defined by borders between one nation and another, between one language group and another, between religious groups one and another, make cooperation and governance more difficult. We talked about that last week. That seems to fit in exactly with what Madison is talking about. How do you attain order and stability in that kind of a complex, divided situation? Here's the point that I heard in one of the reports the other day that I had heard nowhere else. The city of Brussels. I had no idea that one of the reporters, one of the on-site reporters for one of the networks was making the point that Brussels has always been known in Europe and bragged about as the open city, the most open city in Europe. Why? Because the city of Brussels is comprised of 90 different political units, 90 separate precincts, each of them with its own police force. In other words, the city of Brussels is organized chaos. It is so divided internally that its ability to function as a city, as an entity, becomes very difficult. None of this reared its head and became an issue until the terrorist bombing of a couple of weeks ago. Conclusion: the very structure, the very organization of the political situation in Europe gives a tremendous advantage to the terrorists who know no boundaries. They don't represent one particular nation or one particular ethnic group. They can go anywhere and do anything with maximum efficiency. And they're able to do it more easily because mainstream society is not organized in such a way that it can effectively counter that kind of a threat. When I heard that, I immediately thought of this debate between Madison and Hamilton. Because what Hamilton is talking about is a top-down, efficient structure for governance, where order comes from the top and is imposed on those at the bottom. And the strong government that makes policy has at its disposal the military force necessary to impose it. This becomes very clear in 1793 with the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. One of the proposals, one of the ingredients of Hamilton's financial program was the excise tax. The imposition of a federal tax on very specific items that would carry the excise. One of those items was alcohol. And a lot has been written about Western farmers with inadequate infrastructure, inadequate road systems that made it very difficult to transport grain to market. But transferring or transposing grain into alcohol made transportation much easier and much more effective. The point was that many people in the more rural areas of America, of what we call now Appalachia, were involved in the manufacture of alcohol. When government imposed an excise tax on that alcohol and then sent federal tax collectors out to enforce the will of government, that is an example of Hamilton's approach of top-down lawmaking and enforcement. And when the rebels resisted the federal tax collectors, Hamilton prevailed upon President Washington to send a military force of 15,000 troops into western Pennsylvania to crush the rebellion. Hamilton believed that this insurrection over the whiskey tax was an opportunity for government to demonstrate that in this popular government, free speech or no, that when government passed a law, government had the power to enforce it. And he saw the use of federal troops as a way to drive home the message of how law and order was going to function in this new society under the Constitution. That, to me, seems to be an illustration of one way of organizing your political system in order to guarantee stability and order. It's not the way that Madison envisions in Federalist Number 10. It's not the way that Madison envisioned in his letter on party, published in January of 1792 in the National Gazette. Let me remind you, and let me invite you to take advantage of our phone number. Right now it's almost 30 minutes past the hour. It's 26 minutes after the hour. We still have a half an hour to go in today's program. But I want to remind you of the opportunity to participate and share your thoughts on some of this stuff. This is really important, it seems to me, especially as we move towards one of the most contested elections in the nation's history right now. This particular election of 2016 seems to suggest things that we haven't seen before. We have the leading candidates. Of the four major candidates in the two parties, three of them represent or seem to reflect frustration and anger on the part of the electorate. This is a very volatile situation, political situation we're in. I think a lot of this background and a lot of this insight from the 18th century and the wisdom of the founders becomes especially important in order to better understand and know exactly where they were coming from. We do have a phone number, as I've mentioned. If you pick up the phone and call area code 304-663-4676, 304-663-4676, you'll get into the Head On Radio Network studios. Bob Kincaid is there. You'll be on the air immediately. We would love to hear from you. And again, please feel free to share your thoughts in an email if you don't want to go on the air. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. Later in the year 1792, in September, on the 23rd, the date of the article is the 22nd of September. It appears in the National Gazette on the 23rd. Madison writes a piece entitled A Candid State of Parties. Madison is laying out the political realities that exist in the new nation in the fall of 1792 as the nation moves towards the first elections under the Constitution. In other words, this is the second federal election under the Constitution of the United States. This is the one where Washington in 1792 is unanimously reaffirmed for another term as President of the United States. At this time, as the nation gears up for the fall elections in 1792, Madison takes pen in hand and publishes in the National Gazette his view, what he calls the candid view, of the political realities of what's going on in this country. And the fact of the matter is, much of what he predicted in his January article, he says in September has come to pass. And what we see is a nation divided between two groups, two parties, two interest groups. One committed to the ideals of Republican government, the other committed to the traditional ideas of power in the hands of those few at the top. In other words, Madison believes by the fall of 1792 that the nation seems to be irreparably divided between two groups. And the implication is that the republic itself could be in jeopardy. Because not only did government under Hamilton not pay attention to the program he laid out in January of that year, but in fact, government continued to play a role as participant in the factional divisions which divided society. Government had enlisted itself on the side of the few against the many in a popular government. There's no question in 1792, obviously hindsight is 2020. There's no question. If you look at the analysis that Madison does in the fall of 92, you can almost predict the Whiskey Rebellion. The situation is ripe for that kind of a situation to engulf the nation, and indeed it happens the following year in 1793. Madison says that there are three periods in American history up to this time when the nation finds itself divided by factionalism, by parties. The first one was in the debate over independence itself. The second one was in debate over the Constitution between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The nation was divided into these two larger groups, those who supported the Constitution and those who opposed it in favor of states' rights as it existed under the Articles of Confederation. But Madison points out that with the inauguration of President Washington as the unanimous selection for president, the differences, the party differences over the Constitution seem to be pretty much under control. One of the things we know is that Madison himself, as a member of Congress, undertakes to fulfill his commitment to support a Bill of Rights and his determination to avoid a second constitutional convention by adopting a series of amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Madison believes will finally eliminate the opposition created by the debate over the Constitution and will put everybody in the nation on the same track, headed in the same direction. So Madison himself is instrumental in fulfilling the programs and the policies designed to create the unity which the existence of two parties struggling over the Constitution seemed to create in the new nation. But now Madison suggests a third party division has occurred. He points out, however, that this kind of division is natural to most political societies, especially popular governments like ours. As a result of the Constitution, he says, the nation finds itself split into two groups. One he calls anti-Republicans. The other one, which he represents, he calls Republican. because these are the people committed to the vision and the ideals and the principles of Republican government. So let's look at Madison's explanation or analysis of these two party divisions. He says, quote, one of the divisions consists of those who from particular interest, from natural temper, or from the habits of life, are more partial to the opulent than to the other classes of society. And having debauched themselves into a persuasion that mankind are incapable of governing themselves, it follows with them, of course, that government can be carried on only by the pageantry of rank, the influence of money and emoluments, and the terror of military force. Madison said you got one group in society who believes that the few ought to make all the rules. These are people who are convinced that the average common people are incapable of governing themselves. These are the people, the elitists, who have always believed that those from wealth, those from particular families, those from positions of power and influence, those from the established families that have always managed power in America, need to continue to exercise that power. They believe that they and only they are qualified to make the important decisions for this new society, and that the average people, republicanism or no, are incapable of governing themselves. These people always believe that they need the terror of military force in order to impose their will. They anticipate that some people at the bottom are going to oppose their exercise of power, and they are more than willing to inflict military force on the insurgents in order to restore stability in society. Men of these sentiments, Madison says, must naturally wish to point to the measures of government less to the interests of the many than of the few, and less to the reason of the many than to their weaknesses, hoping perhaps in proportion to the ardor of their zeal that by giving such a turn to the administration, government itself may by degrees be narrowed into fewer hands and approximated to an hereditary form. These people believe that the turmoil associated with independence and the construction of the Constitution, now that it's settled, we need to get back to business as usual where the right people make the key decisions. It's that simple. Madison says that's one group. His implication, of course, is this is the group represented by and reflected in the policies of the Federalists, the policies of the administration. And it is against those anti-Republican policies and programs that those in favor of Republican government, favor of republicanism, find themselves in a position of having to organize in order to resist. The other division, Madison said, this is the one obviously he belongs to, consists of those who believe in the doctrine that mankind are capable of governing themselves, and hating hereditary power as an insult to the reason and an outrage to the rights of man, are naturally offended at every public measure that does not appeal to the understanding and to the general interest of the community, or that is not strictly conformable to the principles and conducive to the preservation of Republican government. So those in power are trying to restore privilege for the few. The masses of the people for whom Republican government was created find themselves in a position of having to organize in order to resist this rule from the top. And again, thinking back, this is exactly the rule that Hamilton predicted in Federalist Number 9. Top-down exercise of power in order that the new government under the Constitution could restore order and repress insurgency from above. The states couldn't do it under the Confederation, Hamilton believed. The new government under the Constitution will have the power to do that. It's against this hereditary tradition, this elitism, if you will, that Madison believes that the Republican forces must organize and must unite. This, Madison says, is the real state of parties among us. An experienced and dispassionate observer will be at no loss to decide on the probable conduct of each. This is what we're dealing with, Madison says in September of 1792. This is what we're dealing with, and the direction that this situation takes us in is quite predictable. The anti-Republican Party, Madison said, notice he doesn't call them Federalists. He calls them anti-Republicans. The anti-Republican Party, as it may be called, being the weaker in point of numbers, will be induced by the most obvious motives to strengthen themselves with the men of influence, particularly of moneyed, which is the most active and insinuating influence. It will be equally their true policy to weaken their opponents by reviving exploded parties and taking advantage of all prejudices, local, political, and occupational, that may prevent or disturb a general coalition of sentiments. Madison is pointing out here that the strategy of the few, of the anti-Republican group, is going to be to revive exploded parties. In other words, to intentionally build divisions within society in order to make it impossible for their opponents to organize. From his position in the House, Madison is basically predicting that what they're going to do is try to conquer us under the principle of divide and conquer. They're going to emphasize the differences between us. They're going to do everything they can do to make it difficult for us to organize. Madison is predicting that this is exactly the political strategy that they will adopt. Our group, the Republican Party, as it may be termed, Madison says, conscious that the mass of the people in every part of the Union, in every state, and of every occupation must at bottom be with them, both in interest and sentiment, will naturally find their account in burying all antecedent questions, in banishing every other distinction than that between enemies and friends to Republican government, and in promoting a general harmony among the latter, wherever residing, however employed. Madison is suggesting that our only strategy is to resist the divisions that exist within us, to repress the sentiments and prejudices which make it difficult for us to unite. We have to find a way to control all of these, put aside our differences, and find ways to see ourselves all as friends to Republican government, and therefore recognizing that what we have to do is to create a general harmony among us, wherever we are, whatever we do. What we need to do for purposes of this struggle is to pursue harmony amongst ourselves by downplaying the differences between us. So what Madison is doing here in the fall of '92 is predicting the nature of political party organization and structure as it is going to function in the nation for the next several decades. In this document, Madison is laying out the kinds of divisions which are going to dictate the political elections that the nation experiences over and over and over again, usually generated by these same two groups. The few who seek power because they deserve it, and the many who support Republican government because it indeed does give them access to power that no other form of government gives them. This is the classic struggle, the classic debate within our society that defines the reality and the need for a political process that can somehow manage, direct, and ultimately contain these divisions and turn them from negative into a positive. In other words, what Madison is doing in this particular document in the fall of '92 is laying out the political realities of a divided society under Republican government, and is basically suggesting that our divisions, our differences, must be decided at the ballot box, not on the battlefield. I think what Madison has done is lay out the formula, lay out the ingredients for a modern political party which will turn the unfortunate reality of factions into the kind of positive which will create order within a political situation that seems to suggest chaos. I think that this is an incredibly important document in its own right. Madison closes this document with what I think is a prediction of our political future. Whether the Republican or the rival party will ultimately establish its ascendance is a problem which may be contemplated now, but which time alone can solve. On one hand, experience shows that in politics as in war, stratagem is often an overmatch for numbers. Just as we know in military history that shrewd strategy oftentimes will outweigh numbers, military numbers, so also we're recognizing that same situation exists in politics. That strategy can outweigh or overmatch numbers. And among more happy characteristics of our political situation, it's now well understood that there are peculiarities, some temporary, others more durable, which may favor that side in the contest. Madison here is acknowledging that the anti-Republican group, the few, the wealthy, the powerful, have distinct advantages. What they lack in numbers, they make up in manipulative skills. in strategy, in money, in influence and power. I give you Citizens United. I give you the power of corporations to pour incredible amounts of money into our political process in order to buy influence in our political system. But Madison points out that there are advantages on the other side as well. On the Republican side, again, he says, the superiority of numbers is so great, their sentiments are so decided, and the practice of making a common cause where there is a common sentiment and common interest, in spite of circumstantial and artificial distinctions, is so well understood that no temperate observer of human affairs will be surprised if the issue in the present instance should be reversed and the government be administered in the spirit and form approved by the great body of people. Don't be surprised, Madison is saying, if we're able to pull this off, if we're able to emphasize our common sentiments and our common interests to the point that the efforts of those who would oppose us to divide us are unsuccessful, don't be surprised if we're able to pull this off and win this thing. And of course he does in 1800 with the victory of Thomas Jefferson. What we are seeing laid out here on paper is the formula, is the agenda, is the script for an organized political system to build order and structure into what appears on the surface to be chaos. This is the ingredient of the modern two-party system as we know it. All we need to do from here on is fill in the details. Open up the system so that everybody can participate by dropping property qualifications for voting and office holding and making it possible for every adult white male, and that's all we're talking about at this point, to participate in the system, to believe that they have a voice, to actively exercise that voice in the organization of the political contests which will be regularly featured as part of this nation's political history. Implement another reform. Get rid of the old caucus system where the party leaders decide who the nominees, who the candidates are going to be. Open it up to conventions. Let the people decide who the candidates are going to be. In other words, give people direct access to the candidates that will be running for the respective parties, not just the choice of candidates picked in some closed door, behind some closed doors by party leaders. Conduct through the newspapers, through the freedom of speech and freedom of the press as laid out in our Bill of Rights, the political behavior necessary to inform the public of what the issues are, organize the public, and so educate them so that they can function intelligently in expressing their will in the political system. There's no question in my mind that James Madison has laid out in 1792 the script for what becomes modern two-party politics in America. It's important to recognize that nowhere in the Constitution of the United States is the mention of party even ever included. Madison quickly realizes that the natural, inevitable divisions within an open society, within a free society, factions, will bring down this system unless we can find a way to structure and organize popular government in such a way that the system builds within itself its own stability, its own security. We're within 5 minutes of the end of our program today. It's right now 55 minutes after the hour. Let me say that in covering these documents, we may have addressed one of the most controversial, complex challenges in early American history. Historians, for a long time, have been hard put to trace the transition. What is it that turns the negative of party, the negative of faction, into the positive of two-party government that our whole political system is able to function around for the bulk of its history? Where did it come from? Who saw it? Did anybody envision it? Well, we know that Edmund Burke did. We know that Lord Bolingbroke did in 17th century England. We know that the idea of a loyal opposition within Parliament was, they believed, the kind of check that would institutionally create and guarantee good government. But within a system like ours, where the masses of people could participate in the system, the first thing you've got to do, if you're going to eliminate the possibility that people will think that this government is governed by the few, by the well-positioned, by the moneyed, the first thing you got to do is you got to get rid of qualifications, property qualifications for office holding and for voting. You got to send the message that in this society, when we create Republican government, we really mean it. If you are a citizen in this society, you have the right to participate in making the rules that govern this society. In other words, Madison, in his 1829 letter supporting the abolition of property qualifications, is merely following through on the script that he has written here in the early 90s. To Madison, political parties go from being the greatest threat to Republican government to the most valid guarantee of the stability of popular government. Madison has successfully turned a negative into a positive. He has laid the ingredients of the modern two-party system, which political scientists have been playing with and trying to understand ever since. I think Madison's wisdom and vision and insight is astounding. I hope that you agree. We're at 58 minutes after the hour, and we're kind of at the end of our program today, at the end of our week's programs as well. I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Virtual Center. I want to encourage you to continue to support not only this program, but the Head On Radio Network that gives us the opportunity to be on the air with you each afternoon on these programs. I hope that you'll have a wonderful evening. I hope that you have a wonderful weekend, and that you'll be able to join us when we get back together again the first of next week here at the Virtual Center. For Bob Kincaid and his folks at Head On, let me thank you for your support of the Virtual Center. Let me encourage you to be kind to each other. Hug each other whenever you can. And thank you.